Okay, we're going to start with our next book. This is the British Atlantic World. I'm going to start with an overview, the preface through chapter 1. And so let's start with the beginning here. So what this book is, it's a collection of essays adapted from papers given at a conference at Harvard. This is the second edition. The last two chapters were added on after the first publication of the book. So this is sort of the field of Atlantic world history beginning to define itself and being having a prominent historian kind of give it his blessing as a sort. So what the section we're going to talk today is sort of the theoretical underpinnings for this whole business of Atlantic world history. So it's a little theory heavy, but the rest of the essays are really kind of specific, so they'll be much easier to go through. So the preface is written by Bernard Bailyn, which he is a very prominent colonial historian. And so his sort of journey to becoming or viewing this British Atlantic world as kind of an Atlantic world system is sort of, I guess, adding to the bona fides of this particular business. So what he did, his journey is, he starts off as a colonial historian, and what he found was that in order to understand the specific colonies he was examining, he had to continue to widen his field. And as he widened his field, he encountered more and more things that are linked to it. So his journey into this sort of larger vision of Atlantic world history is from sort of the very local and then expanding outwards. He talks a bit in the preface about how his worldview has come to encompass this idea of the Atlantic world, and that Atlantic world history is beginning to establish itself as an independent field of analysis. He also sees, and this is a good question to think about yourself when you're thinking about history. History is both a story, so it's about telling narratives about events and things that go on, but also a study in which you apply examination of these events in an effort to understand and analyze what these events mean. Bernard Bailyn writes the preface. It's sort of, just giving an overview of Atlantic world history as a concept. And then the introduction is written by Armitage and Braddick. And so this would be useful to know how these types of books get written after a conference. A conference call goes out. People submit their panel ideas. There's an organizing committee who selects which ones to be included. So then they set up panels that deal with different topics. And then they have individual panelists who present their research. So that process results in a conference in which you have 1, 2, or 3 panels going on at the same time. Everybody splits up and goes to different panels. You end up with, I don't know, somewhere around, in this case, I think there were 50 papers that were presented. So from those 50, they select ones that they think most exemplify the broad sweep of Atlantic world history, and ones that they found particularly compelling. So those papers are then, the people who presented those papers are requested to turn them into an extended essay, right? And so what you have is the kernel of these things were originally papers, and then they're turned into essays which are collected into this book. The introduction and the conclusion are usually written by the editors because they want to provide some sort of unifying idea to these variety of papers or variety of essays at this point. So providing some sort of coherence in the structure is what the editors do in the introduction, and sometimes they also tie it up in the conclusion. And as we'll see in today's example, one of the editors then provides the sort of theoretical underpinnings for what they're doing. So in the introduction, Armitage and Braddick say, this Atlantic world system is part of an emerging world system. So they're immediately telling you that this is, as big as this is, the Atlantic world, in which we're talking about 4 continents at least that border this Atlantic Ocean basin, that it's actually part of a larger system. And so examining how this system evolved and developed and how it relates to the larger system is part of what they're doing with this idea of Atlantic world. They also are very careful to say this is not a full definition of the approaches, right? So thinking back to what I said about this being a conference, you have papers that are dedicated to sort of specific examples. And then those specific examples are illustrations of what Atlantic world is or could be. And so what Armitage and Braddick are saying here is that this doesn't encompass everything that is Atlantic world history. They just find it to be a useful set of illustrations of how one goes about it, right? So how does one go about doing Atlantic world history? That's sort of how they selected these papers. Okay, so now let's get to Armitage's first chapter. So Armitage says this Atlantic world, in order to understand it, it's linked to something else that historians talk about. It's called the modern period. And the modern period is marked by the development of nation states as opposed to independent kingdoms, sort of the complexity of these nation state organizations, ruling peoples in and ruling peoples out. This process of expanding the rule beyond just the king and royal officials. So the development of complex systems like parliaments or congresses or things like that. It's also tied to the beginning of industrialization, right? So industrialization is also part of what is known as the modern age of modernity. So the Atlantic world begins to some degree before that. A convenient place to start is 1500 because it's just a few years after Christopher Columbus. And this particular British Atlantic world is going to discuss 1500 to 1800. So 1800 is really when we're entering into the sort of modern age. In terms of nation state, one of the earliest markers of the nation state is the French Revolution, in which the authority of the crown is overthrown by a collection of the people who then are unified by their Frenchness and are ruling out other peoples because they're not French. So this sort of nationalism and nation state idea is encompassed as part of this modernity. And Armitage says this Atlantic world is a European creation. It has to be a European creation because without Europe, the Atlantic world does not exist, right? And so you can think about it in the simplest terms. It was people from Europe who sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World and not vice versa. So this is both, in the physical sense, a European creation. Europeans were the ones who sailed about this system. But it's also because of the Europeans who traveled and their particular mindsets and cultural formations and styles of government and religions they bring that sort of create this entity as well. Because the Europeans are not just bringing themselves and their colonial ideas, they're also bringing a large market system, which is part of this system as well. We just spoke at some length about part of this market system, the Atlantic slave trade. And so Armitage says, traditionally, this concept of a European story has seen, for lack of a better term, as a white story, right? So we're talking about Europeans and what they do. And he says, the Atlantic world is actually, it's not just a white story. Certainly, white Europeans are part of it. And then he bends the concept of what this coloring scheme means. So he says it's a multicolored thing. Right? So it's not just a white story, it's also a black story. So we have Africans in this system and not just as people being enslaved, but in places where where the black population begins to concentrate, you have the development of their own particular cultural and social norms, right? So part of this Atlantic world story is a story of Africans, right? Slaved and free, or slaved and freeing themselves, or and the communities that they create. He says it's also a green story, right? So green, not an environmental, but green as in terms of Irish. So the Irish are both colonized, right? So the British colonize Ireland first. And so you have the transplantation of some folks from Scotland and England to Ireland, but then you also have a multitude of Irish people from the island, Irish Catholics, who also enter into this system, and they're both colonized. They're under the colonial rule of the English Empire, what becomes Great Britain. But they're also going out into this system. So it's also, you can tell a green story of this Atlantic world. And he says, and there's also been research to talk about it as a red story, red not as in native peoples or first Americans, but red as in terms of Marxism, right? So you can talk about this, and there are historians who talk about the Atlantic world in terms of, you know, the classic Marxist interpretation of the working class and the ruling class, and you know, the various things that are associated with Marxism, right? So Armitage says, you know, we have to sort of expand the boundaries of what this Atlantic world has traditionally been referred to as sort of a colonial story. So Armitage says he has three concepts of Atlantic history, and these are sort of the theoretical underpinnings of Atlantic history. It's a little complex, and so I'm going to work through this theory, and then the rest of the examples through the book are much easier conceptually to understand. They tend to be more discrete. This is a little bit more theory driven. So he says the three concepts of Atlantic history: there's the Circum Atlantic, there's the transatlantic, and there's the cisatlantic, right? And so cisatlantic is not usually a word you hear. So all three of these, he's going to provide his sort of theoretical underpinnings for that. So we'll talk about the Circum Atlantic, right? So the Circum Atlantic is traveling around the Atlantic Ocean, right? And treating the Atlantic Ocean as a zone of exchange and interchange. So it's ships traveling across, right? So the Atlantic slave trade, the goods that are traverse this system, that would be sort of the Circum Atlantic. You're traveling about trading things. So it's things that move around. So you can think of sugar, or you can think of tobacco, or you can think of people, or you can think of you know, the colonizers themselves, right? These are all the things that move around. People, free and unfree, move around. The cities on the rim, so the port cities of Port Royal, the city of I don't know, the city of Liverpool, the city of wherever, right? So Boston. So all these cities are port cities, and they're part of this Atlantic world system. So they're on the rim, right? So we saw things that move around as well. We saw in our first book with Crosby. Diseases travel along, flora, fauna, right? So these types of things that move along the rim of the surface and then traverse, right? People may be leaving one area, you know, so for example, they're leaving England, but are still part of the same world. So even if they go from England to Port Royal, or they go from England to Jamestown, even though they're on the other side of the Atlantic, they're still part of the same Atlantic world, right? What Armitage says, you know, this has traditionally been, you know, it lends itself to empire stories. So we, you know, reading about the Spanish Empire, or the Portuguese Empire, or the Dutch Empire, or the British Empire, right? So all these empire stories are about the Atlantic. But Armitage makes an example, he draws upon an example that illustrates it's more than just, you know, this sort of empire story of goods being exchanged by the, let's say, along the Spanish Main or some such thing, right? And so he gives an example of silver, right? And the silver example nicely illustrates how this is much more complex. Silver refers to what the Spanish were digging out of, or forcing people to dig out of the ground, generally native people. So there's a mine known as Potosi. And Potosi is this massive mound of silver that the Spanish forced people to mine out for more than a century, right? And so this is an enormous quantity of silver that traverses back to Spain, right? So that's simple to see, Spanish Empire, Circum Atlantic. But it turns out that only a percentage of the silver went back to Spain. In fact, a very large percentage, more than a third, actually never went back to Spain directly. It actually went through a Spanish port, Acapulco, and then was traded to the Philippines, where it is eventually traded to the Chinese, right? A lot of the silver that was dug out of the ground by the Spaniards or those operating for the Spaniards ended up going to China. This makes China part of the Atlantic world in ways that you wouldn't necessarily think of, right? So the silver, some of it never goes to Spain. It goes out the Pacific side and it travels to China, but it is still part of this Atlantic world system, even though it never touches the Atlantic world, because the Spanish are acquiring this silver and are using it for trade. What they're trading for is things that China has. Spain wants it, or Spanish merchants want that to trade with other folks. And so they're using this silver that is part of this Atlantic world system to actually purchase goods directly from China. So goods that go through Acapulco to the Philippines to China never touch the Atlantic Ocean, but they're still part of this Circum Atlantic world. Okay, transatlantic history. This is not accurate completely to say it's international history, because we really don't have nation states yet, right? But it is a type of international history. And so it's thinking about how you compare one nation's interactions with another, right? So transatlantic history is history told through comparisons. There are a number of these stories, right? So some of those are north-south stories, and these are relatively common in this sort of discussion of the Atlantic world. And so comparing British slavery to Spanish slavery. Okay, so here we have the Spaniards are in the South, in South America or Central America or Mexico and Florida. And then the British have sugar islands in the Caribbean, but then they also have their possessions in North America. So what are the similarities between slavery in this system, and what are the differences? Simple comparisons, right? So you're comparing two nations, although really kind of two empires, how they organize this business of the Atlantic slave trade, right? So that's simple to see. But Armitage says there's other types of international comparisons that aren't being done, but they could be, right? And so he says there could be east-west. So if you think north-south, the British and the Spanish, or the British and the Portuguese, or the French and the Spanish, whatever, right? So an east-west would be, instead of just focusing on one component of this, we could talk about sort of the intellectual components. So you have two revolutions. The British have the Glorious Revolution, which installs a particular system of government. And it could be compared to the American Revolution, which installs its own system of government. And so comparisons could be made between those sort of revolutionary approaches. Not much work has been done on it. It's something that Armitage is interested in. He says this too would be a type of transatlantic history. Okay. The third one he wants to talk about, or the third category of Atlantic history he talks about, is the cis-Atlantic. And this is local and regional histories told in an Atlantic world context, right? So the argument here is that the Atlantic extends beyond just the seashores where it washes up in the port cities, right? So these are local and regional histories that are part of the Atlantic world and are shaped by the Atlantic world, even when they don't physically touch the Atlantic Ocean. And so he gives some nice examples. And he says it breaks down artificial boundaries. And I always like the example of the way the textbooks draw maps today. The way textbooks draw maps in, let's say, an empire, is that some textbooks, what they will do is they will adopt a shading. So the old system was you would draw the Roman Empire and you draw the thick black line, and it carries with it the suggestion that here you're in the Roman Empire and there you're out, right? So by drawing a line on a map, it says you're in or out. And it's a hard line, right? Even if it's just a hard line on a map, you're either in the Roman Empire or you're not, right? So But that's not really how the world works. The world works where the Caesar could have his writ, his order of law, but the further you remove yourself from Rome, the more that order of law is negotiable. So instead of drawing a hard line of you're in or out, that there's a shading, right? So near the borders, particularly borders between two different empires, there's overlap. It's not a clear hard line. The people who live in those border areas, they kind of go whatever way they want, and whoever's, threatening them the most, right? So instead of being a hard line, there's a shaded line that things are more closely linked, right? So thinking about now turning that context to the Atlantic world, so the British may draw lines on the map and they may say, this is French territory and this is British territory and this is Spanish territory. But on the ground itself, things are much more negotiable. So it's really the ability to extend your power. And so I just talked about three empires, the British, French, and the Spanish, but that of course is not really where most of the negotiations go on. Most of the negotiations go on with the native peoples. So instead of this sort of traditional empire business of the British show up and impose their will on native peoples, there's actually a much greater period of negotiations in which the local peoples have more power than the British Empire does, because it's the ability to deploy it. So British traders could come and say, we represent England and we have a powerful navy, and the Iroquois would say, that's great, where are they, right? It's just you, and there's all of us. So that notion of negotiations as negotiated space is part of this idea of cisatlantic. This leads to the creation of what a historian by the name of Richard White calls the middle grounds. And they're the places where neither side has sway, neither side dominates. And so those sort of middle grounds between the two empires, the Iroquois and the British, right? The Wampanoags and the Pilgrims, right? That middle ground where neither one can dominate is a place where negotiation and trade happens. So if the Iroquois go into New York or travel to London, they're at a tremendous disadvantage, right? Because they're in the heart of the empire. Conversely, if British traders go into upstate New York and are negotiating at the home village of the Oneida, then the Oneida have the power to negotiate, right? So those sort of power imbalances restrict trade. Sometimes merchants are willing to make those deals, but you're usually negotiating at a disadvantage. Places where you negotiate at an equal advantage would be those middle grounds where neither side can bring their empire power to bear. And so those places shift, right? So when the British are just clinging to the coast, then most of the power resides with the native peoples, and so those middle grounds are very close to the British settlements. But as the British expand and the native peoples contract for various reasons, as we've already seen, then the power relations shift. But that's a process that continues, right? So it moves us off the Atlantic rim and into the interior. And so one of the easiest places to see this is the fur trade, right? So trapping beavers in the Rocky Mountains would not seem to be part of the Atlantic world system, but it is, because the beaver pelts are being traded eventually to the French, who are delivering them to Europe, and in exchange, they're bringing European goods. So even in the Rocky Mountains, people trapping beaver or fox or whatever pelts are valuable in this system, they're part of the Atlantic world system, although they may not even know the existence of an Atlantic Ocean, right? So this is sort of the cisatlantic in which that Atlantic world bends and shapes and distorts people far removed from it. So it links that cisatlantic links internal and external events to it, right? So it's another way of thinking about the movement of people. So if you're in Scotland and the population moves, as we shall see, they're moving to, let's say, Central America, right? So The Scots are leaving, so they're migrating out, right? And they're coming to Central America to establish a colony they hope to get rich upon. So they're emigrating out and immigrating in, but they're all still within the Atlantic world system. So even though they're migrating, right, instead of seeing them as leaving one system and entering another, they're operating still within the same system. That's what Hist Atlantic is. So those are sort of the structural or philosophical underpinnings for the stories that you're going to be reading in the days coming ahead. Again, as always, I will build a discussion board with some questions. Take a look at those questions and take a run at them, and we will go from there. Again, any questions, feel free to post them.